In 1734, miners deep inside an Austrian mountain broke through a collapsed tunnel wall and found a man, skin intact, hair intact, his clothes and his tools still sitting exactly where he'd dropped them. He'd died in a rockfall roughly 2,500 years earlier, and the mineral he'd been digging for had kept him almost perfectly preserved the entire time. That mineral killed him and refused to let him rot, both at once. Here's the question worth sitting with before we go any further. What was this man doing that far underground, digging for something you now sprinkle on eggs without even looking down? And here's the number that should genuinely unsettle you. Your own body cannot survive more than a couple of weeks without exactly what he was mining. For 300,000 years, with no shakers, no mines, no trade routes, humans needed a steady supply of this substance just to keep their hearts beating. So how did they get enough of it to stay alive at all? Start with a fact most people get completely backwards. Salt isn't seasoning. Salt is structural. Somewhere around 250 grams of sodium chloride, roughly a coffee mug's worth, sits dissolved through your blood, your bones, the fluid surrounding every cell in your body. Your blood sodium has to stay inside a razor-thin range and slip meaningfully outside it, and you get confusion, then nausea, then seizures. Every thought you've ever had was an electrical signal, and that signal runs on sodium ions physically crossing the membranes of your neurons. Every heartbeat depends on the same mechanism, and you're leaking it constantly, through urine, through tears, and especially through sweat. Humans are among the sweatiest mammals alive, the exact trait that let your ancestors run prey animals into heat exhaustion under an open sun, out-enduring animals that could easily outrun them in a sprint. That superpower comes with a bill attached, and the bill gets paid in sodium, sometimes close to a gram of it, lost in a single hour of hard labor in real heat. Your ancestors were bleeding out the one mineral they had no obvious way to replace, hour after hour, whether they were hunting, walking, or simply surviving an ordinary afternoon. So how did they not simply die? Here's what almost nobody tells you about early hunter-gatherers. For most of them, this problem barely existed, because they weren't eating salt directly at all. They were eating animals that had already done the work for them. A deer spends its entire life slowly gathering sodium out of plants, soil, and water, concentrating it in its blood, its liver, its marrow. Kill that animal and eat it whole. The organs, the blood pooled in the body cavity, everything a modern kitchen throws straight in the trash, and you're drinking down a mineral reserve the animal spent years accumulating for you. We have real evidence this worked, and it comes from one of the most cited datasets in nutrition science. In the 1980s, researchers running the InterSalt study measured sodium intake across 52 populations worldwide, and the Yanomami of the Amazon rainforest returned a 24-hour urinary sodium reading of less than 1, roughly a 200th of what an average American consumes today. Their blood pressure sat around 95/61, and it didn't climb with age. No hypertension, none found at all. Australian physiologist Derek Denton spent decades explaining the mechanism behind this in his 1982 book The Hunger for Salt, describing a dedicated craving circuit, ancient as land vertebrates, that switches on the moment your reserves run low and makes salty food taste almost unbearably good. Your ancestors weren't searching for salt on purpose. They were simply eating it without ever knowing it existed. So what actually broke this quiet, functioning system? Not scarcity, agriculture. Around 10,000 years ago, humans started planting grain, and the diet flipped completely. Meat and organs moved to the edges of the plate, and wheat, barley, and rice, all of it nearly sodium-free, moved into the center. A bowl of boiled grain will fill your belly and feed a village while delivering almost no sodium whatsoever. Worse, farming chained people permanently to one patch of ground, and if that ground happened to sit far from any natural salt source, walking somewhere better was no longer an option. And farmers, hauling water and threshing grain under an open sun, sweat out even more sodium than the hunters they'd replaced. Estimates for Paleolithic sodium intake sit somewhere around 700 milligrams a day, mostly incidental, mostly from animals. Once grain took over, entire communities were suddenly losing far more than they were taking in. That's not a minor dietary shift. That's a slow-motion emergency, unfolding across millions of people at once. And it's the exact crisis that forced humans to start actually hunting for salt on purpose for the first time in our species' history. Here's the strangest part of the whole story. Humans didn't figure out where to find salt through cleverness alone. Animals showed them first. Visit almost any natural salt deposit on Earth, and you'll find it surrounded by trails, deep, ancient paths worn into the landscape by generations of hooves returning to the same spot. The most spectacular example sits on the slopes of Mount Elgon in Kenya, inside a cave called Kitum, carved from ancient volcanic rock. At night, elephants walk as far as 200 meters into total blackness, using paths they've known since they were calves, scraping the rock face with their tusks to break off sodium-rich stone and eat it. The cave itself has been slowly widened over thousands of years by elephants doing exactly this. Picture an early human noticing that pattern. You don't need chemistry. You just need to see that every animal for miles keeps returning to the same white patch of ground, and that if you follow them, you'll eventually arrive somewhere important. Animal trails became human trails. Human trails became roads that still exist today, including one in Italy, old enough that it predates Rome itself. Once people realized salt could be manufactured, not just found, the archaeology gets genuinely startling. At a site called Poiana Slatinei in eastern Romania, archaeologists led by Olivier Weller uncovered scorched earth, ash layers, and thousands of fragments of crude, throwaway clay pottery used purely to boil brine down into hard, portable salt cakes. Radiocarbon dating puts this at roughly 6050 BC. 8,000 years ago, before the wheel, before writing, before the pyramids by 3.5 millennia, people in the Carpathian foothills were already running what amounts to an industrial production line. A few hundred miles south in Bulgaria, a site called Provadia Solnitsata pushes the story even further. Excavations there, led by archaeologist Vasil Nikolov, uncovered salt production dating back to roughly 5500 BC, eventually scaling up enough that the settlement built a stone wall nearly 10 feet thick around itself, along with storage buildings and a hoard of gold. Nikolov has argued this may be the oldest fortified town in Europe, built to defend exactly one resource. The first thing humans got wealthy enough to build walls around wasn't gold, it was salt. Here's the piece of this story that quietly explains everything that came after. Salt doesn't just keep your neurons firing, it pulls water directly out of meat and fish, and without that water, the bacteria that cause rot simply can't survive. Salt a catch that would normally spoil within a day, and it lasts a year instead. That single trick is arguably the real foundation of settled civilization, more than the plow, more than the wall. It let people take a good day, a huge catch, a successful hunt, and stretch it across the length of an entire bad season. Every granary, every army that ever marched more than a week from home ran on preserved food, which is exactly why salt eventually became currency in its own right, traded pound for pound against gold across the Sahara, cut into standardized bars, used as literal money in Ethiopia for centuries. In parts of the world with no coastline and no rock salt at all, dense rainforest regions of New Guinea and Central Africa, people found an entirely different workaround, burning specific sodium-rich plants down to ash, and rinsing that ash with water to extract a bitter but genuinely usable mineral substitute, keeping entire communities alive in places the salt roads never reached. Which brings us back to that mountain in Austria, and the man they found in 1734. People had already been mining that same site for roughly 7,000 years by the time he died, digging by torchlight through tunnels built with wooden staircases assembled section by section underground, because getting down to the brine mattered more than almost anything else in their lives. He never knew what sodium was. He couldn't have explained ion gradients or nerve conduction if his life depended on it, and in a very real sense, it did. He just knew, the way every one of his ancestors going back 300,000 years knew, that his body needed the white stuff badly enough to walk into darkness and dig for it with his hands. Every civilization in this story, every road, every wall, every camel caravan crossing a desert, was in some sense a machine built for moving salt from where it existed to where a human body happened to need it. And all of that history is sitting, completely unnoticed, in the little glass shaker on your own kitchen counter, waiting for you to reach for it tomorrow morning without a single thought crossing your mind.